would be covering the theoretical aspects. So, as you all of us know that international politics is all about interaction between various actors called states, and if there are interactions between states, there has to be some kind of coordination or some kind of governing body which must regulate these relations. So, one aspect of regulation of international politics is through the mechanism of diplomacy. So, if we look at the screen now, we see that there are two aspects which are taking place in diplomacy. One is called conflict. So, if you see if there is conflict and persistent conflict, the outcome is a war, and if there is cooperation, we generally see that cooperation is the outcome of diplomacy. So, if we have to see that there is cooperation, there is negotiation, there is stability and world order, then diplomacy is the recourse that we take to. Now, one thing is realized that now national sovereignty in the era of globalization, national sovereignty is not enough. We need to have more aspects added, like if only national sovereignty was the case, then the national government could have governed and regulated world relationship. But we cannot limit these aspects of relationship to national sovereignty. So, we have to go beyond the borders of national territory and sovereignty, and this is where the role of diplomacy comes in. So, if we look at the bullets, it is this is a method of establishing precondition for permanent peace. It is a process of negotiation that is central to the working of world politics, and it includes resolution of conflicts through dialogue and negotiation. So, this is basically the point, the highlighting point that I would be keeping in mind when I am discussing diplomacy. Now, let us go back. Is it a new phenomena, or did it exist in the previous eras as well? Now, if in the 1970s we discovered that diplomacy is not a new event, it was taking place as far back as 2500 BC. The earliest diplomatic document was a letter which was found. It was inscribed on a tablet sent from an area in Mediterranean region called the Ebla to Hamzai, which could be related somehow to the present day modern Iran, northern Iran. Now, not only this, then we had the states of classical Greece, which had diplomatic system with all modern features. They had embassies, they had permanent representatives who would be negotiating in the art of diplomacy. Now, this concept of diplomacy was revived in medieval Europe, most importantly in Italy. Now, Italy was the city states of Renaissance Italy were the breeding grounds of diplomacy and post Reformation Europe. So, if we talk in terms of modern diplomatic process, agenda or structure, we can trace it back to whatever was happening in Renaissance Italy. And finally, in 1815, with the Congress of Vienna, the system was regularized and a permanent diplomatic missions were established between states, and there were permanent representatives. There was a trained staff who would do the diplomatic procedure. Now, if we look at diplomacy, if we want to traditionally define diplomacy, what is diplomacy? Now, I would like to just read it. It refers to a communication process between international actors that seek to resolve conflict short of war. That is, we do not let the situation escalate to a full scale war, but we try to intervene and interrupt the outbreak of a full scale war. And if we talk in terms of in foreign policy, it means achieving policy objectives by associating with economic or military force. So, it is not only political influence that we are trying, we are not using our articulation power, we are also combining it with economic or military force, and this is modern day diplomacy. Now, the ends of diplomacy are policy objective and means are the policy instruments, how we achieve those objectives or the goals that we have. According to one of the most important contributors of international politics, if we look at Hans Morgenthau's definition of diplomacy and what tasks he assigns to diplomacy, we have to look at 4 important things. He clearly says that there are 4 important tasks of diplomacy. First is that diplomacy must determine its objective in background of power actually and potentially available. Actually available is the amount of power that it can use, potentially if all the hidden power that it has. So the objective of a country is a reflection of the amount of power a country has. The second important thing is that it is not an isolative procedure. You have to work in association with other countries. So not only looking at the power scenario of your own country, but looking at the objectives of other nation and the amount of power these other nations have. Now, this is very important because it is a relative concept. So the power of the other nations also have to be assessed. Now, third important task of diplomacy, according to Morgenthau, is that it must determine as to what extent the different objectives are compatible with each other. That is, there are a lot of policy objectives. A country A must be having certain policy objectives, country B may be having certain policy objectives. The best solution would be to have a policy which is compatible with the national interest of both A and B. And the fourth and a most important task of diplomacy is that it must employ effective means to attain its objective. That is, the means that you adopt must be effective. It shouldn't be a half-hearted effort. It should be effective. Whatever policy instruments that you are using must be able to deliver certain results. Now, Morgenthau clearly says that diplomacy is an amalgamation of all the 4. Failure in any one may jeopardize the success of foreign policy, and eventually the peace process gets hampered. Now, the process, if we have to carry out diplomacy as a process or a policy objective, there has to be deployment of certain instruments. How you achieve has to be done through certain instruments. So, what are the 2 important instruments of diplomacy are? First, the foreign office in the capitals of respective nations, which we normally call an embassy or a high commission or permanent resident missions. So, these are the offices of country A in some other country. And second set of instruments are the diplomatic representatives. These include the human resources, the staff, the trained staff, the missionaries, the emissaries, the foreign policy, the foreign service staff. So, all these are included in the diplomatic representative. Now, once they start negotiating with a certain objective in mind, they have certain instruments through which they start doing the diplomatic procedures. There are certain features which the diplomatic instruments must keep in mind. The first thing is that diplomats represent their home government. So, whatever is their outlook is not their own, but they are just a messenger of the policy objective of their home country or the parent country. The second feature is that they communicate to their own government the views and interests of the other. So, as a representative, for example, a diplomat in the Indian diplomat sitting in United States will be communicating the viewpoints and objectives of the government of India to the United States government, and vice versa. They would be bringing in the views of the United States government and communicating it to their own government in their own country. And the third feature is that in negotiation they try to reconcile the interests and views of the others. That is, you cannot have a definite stand, or you cannot just be obstinate, and you cannot not yield to certain views. So, you have to reconcile the interest of and views of the different actors. Now, what are the means of achieving? As I told you, it is all about ends and means, and ends are the policy objective, means are the methods employed to realize those policy objectives. For achieving the task, intelligent diplomacy must employ the following means. The first is dialogue. We must talk, we must present our points of view, we must hear the point of view of the other party. This is dialogue. So, preliminary to any diplomatic procedure or any decision being taken, it is very important that a dialogue must ensue between the countries. The second method is negotiation. That is, we must negotiate, we must be ready to give some, take some. It is not that it is only win-win situation. No, we must be ready to lose some and gain some. So, this is negotiation. Now, third means of achieving is persuasion. That is, you should be persuasive, you should be pushy, you should try to achieve your objective through certain solid arguments, and you try to persuade the other actor to at least listen to your point of view and maybe later incorporate your point of view. Then, as I already told the viewers, that it is also a compromise. It is not always a win-win situation. You have to compromise. There are certain things which I need. If I need to win, I need to lose on certain points. This is called a compromise, and more often than not we realize that it is a happy compromise. It is not always that somebody has to lose, it is a happy compromise. Then if all these things fail, the dialogue not working, negotiation not working, your persuasive powers fail, you are willing to compromise, still the other actor is not willing to accommodate, then the last weapon of last resort is the threat of force, that in the eventuality of nothing happening, we may be able to use force. And this also at times is able to achieve the goal that we had desired before starting the process. Now, if we look at the goals or the ends, then it justifies some of the methods or some of the steps or instruments that we adopted. First end is creating stability. Of course, the world order, as I told you, there are different actors, and the different actors are at different levels of power. Some are middle power, some are great power, some are small powers. So, diplomatic negotiation is not only about equal powers, it is about unequal powers, but still negotiating. So, it has to be creating stability in the world order. Now, the second end is creating order and norms of behavior in international political arena. That is, there are certain norms, there are certain guidelines, and every country is, while negotiating, is expected to abide by those guidelines. For example, recognition or accreditation being granted to the diplomatic mission. So, as a diplomatic representative, a person in some other country has certain immunities, certain privileges, certain advantages. So, these are the norms of behavior. So, if country A is granting diplomatic immunity or privilege to the representatives of country B, then similarly the representatives of country A would expect the same kind of privileges and immunities when they visit or are stationed in country B. Now, looking at the ends, the third end is prevent conflict splitting over into war. This is typically called crisis management. That is, if the world thinks that there is a situation which is definitely going to escalate into a warlike situation, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the role of Henry Kissinger or Nixon was very, very important, because from Khrushchev's diplomatic tactics were also important, because the world would have gone onto the brink of a third world war, and this was averted thanks to the efforts of Henry Kissinger and Khrushchev. So, this is very, very important, that a full scale war does not erupt and the crisis is solved short of a war. This is called crisis management. This is another important end of diplomacy. And the last but not the least end is that national interest is prime. Even if I am working in an international arena, I have to promote my own national interest, I have to guard my own national interest. So, one end is definitely guarding and promoting my own national interest. So, this is another important end of diplomacy. Now, when we talk about functions of diplomatic machine, there are a lot of important functions, and if you look at every function is very important. The first function is called information gathering. Information gathering is important because these are the data inputs which come, and these help in reformulation of policies or informing new policies. So, information gathering in some other country is one important role of the diplomatic machinery. Second is policy advising. Now, supposing India is going to take a policy decision related to a particular aspect of the NRIs or related to the foreign investment in India. Now, it is the role of the Indian diplomats in US to fathom or judge or gauge the reaction of the different political leaders to this particular policy decision. So, when they judge the policy decision reactions, they can then collaborate or collate these reactions and give inputs to their own government that, look, if we are going to implement such and such decision, this is going to be the reaction in the United States political leadership, and therefore, these are the issues that we need to tone down. So, this is policy advising, that they may suggest certain changes in the policy which the government is wanting to implement. Third is representation. Now, representation is of three types. Representation is it is a diplomatic representation, then it is political representation and legal representation. I will do it in details later. Then representation is that it is representing A, the leadership, and B, the people of that country. Then negotiation, it is these people, the diplomatic mission which is involved in the negotiation procedure. They are the ones who are negotiating with the government of the other countries. And because every time there is a negotiation or a policy making, the government or the main leadership, it is not possible for them to travel and be there. So, on behalf of the government, they are the ones who negotiate. And another important service which also comes as a legal representation is called the consular services. That is, they support and protect the home citizens abroad. The citizenship issues related to all the people of a particular country in another country. For example, the Indian citizens in United Kingdom is protected and looked after by the India House, that is the Indian Embassy in London. So, this is the role of the diplomatic machinery. Now, as I told you that one important function of diplomatic machinery was representation. Now, if we look at the representational aspect, then there are three basic roles in representation which emerge. One is called the symbolic representation. That is, for example, the US ambassador in London will represent the point of view and will represent the President and the Council of Ministers of the United States in London. That is called symbolic representation. The second is called legal representation. That is, the ambassador is the legal representative of his government. Example, the US ambassador in London will represent his constitution, the laws of his country, the policies, and he will try to project and he will represent it as if he was the government. So, this is another important legal representation, that is, he is representing the laws, the constitution, the policies of the government in another country. And the third is called, and a part of legal representation then also comes the consular activities, that is, they are protecting the legal interest of the citizens abroad. And the third role of representation is called political representation, that is, how is the policy to be shaped, what are the political reactions, what is the public opinion, all these are gathered and brought to the home government, which then looks, accumulates, assimilates, and then they analyze and then use it in the output of policy making. So, for example, an Indian diplomat in Washington must keep the government informed about the different policy that, for example, the Obama government will take up in its second term. They have to bring the point of view of Obama's government to the Indian government. They have to also take the reaction of Obama's government to the various policy decisions that the Indian government is going to make. And this is, so this two-way process of communication, the channel of communication is kept alive because of the diplomats. Now, if we look at the norms of diplomacy, what are the norms? That is, because it is a game, it is played between different countries, there has to be certain rules of games. So, what are the rules of games to ensure fair play? What are the norms of diplomacy? The first norm is recognition. That is, in international political system, you recognize the other country by establishing diplomatic relations. The very fact that a country is recognized is judged by the fact that this country will have its diplomatic missions all over the world. Now, an embassy, second norm of diplomacy is that an embassy is considered to be the territory of the home state. Example, US embassy in India, within the boundaries of the United States embassy, the rules of United States would run. The Indian rules or laws or the police will have no say whatsoever in whatever is happening inside the wall of the US embassy. For example, the US embassy, during the Tiananmen Square uprising, they harbored a Chinese dissident. When the Chinese government was doing a crackdown on these dissidents, this Chinese dissident, he was sheltered, he was given asylum in the US embassy in 1989, and the Chinese government could not enter the premises of the US embassy. And the third norm of diplomacy is that you have to recognize and agree to the point that every state will try to spy on each other, and this is a fact which nobody can deny. So, this is another norm of diplomacy, that if a country is there, then it will do some activities, some espionage activities, and it is surprisingly these espionage or spying activities are done by the lower level staff of the embassy itself. And because of the fact that these staff are open, not exposed to the laws of the other country, they have to be treated and tried under the laws of their own home country. So, this is the advantage they take. Now, looking at the laws of diplomacy, if we look at the laws of diplomacy, there are certain laws which are very important, and we will discuss this with specific examples when we come in the second series. Diplomatic recognition, that is accreditation, and diplomats must have government credentials. So, it is customary for any country to recognize the diplomats of the other countries and to extend them certain privileges, certain immunities, certain advantages. Second is diplomatic immunity. Every country, every diplomat has certain immunity, that is, he is protected against certain rules, certain norms of behavior. This is called diplomatic immunity. Then there is a third concept called diplomatic pouch. These are packages that are sent between embassies of the embassy in other country and its home countries, and initially there is a saying that these packages used to be very small, which would contain only a couple of letters and some papers, but now these are huge containers, and there have been accusations of lot of arms and ammunitions and other things being passed on in the name of this diplomatic pouch. Incidentally, this diplomatic pouch is not subject to scrutiny by the customs department or the government. It cannot be opened, it cannot be scrutinized. So, it also has a kind of an immunity. And the fourth law of diplomacy is that there has to be diplomatic relations between different countries. That is, if any country which has been recognized by the United Nations and has been duly recognized by other states must establish diplomatic embassies or permanent missions or high commissions in each other's country, because this is the channel of negotiation and communication. Now, if we look at now diplomacy as a procedure has lot of variants. Like diplomacy, you cannot say that this is diplomacy and this has to be replicated in other country. Every aspect of diplomacy is unique. Every country has its own style of conducting its diplomacy. Then some countries follow the traditional style of diplomacy, some carry newer forms of diplomacy, some have their own terms and conditions, some have their own rules of behavior for carrying out diplomatic activities. So, based on this then I would like to categorize 4 kinds of diplomacy. The first is called open or secret diplomacy. If the proceedings, if the diplomatic activities are taking place in open, it is being televised, people are sitting as witnesses, or it is open to scrutiny by public, this is called open diplomacy. So, whenever such diplomatic negotiations are taking place, there is a house sitting and there are people who are just viewers and witnesses, and or either alternatively this proceeding may be taking place only between the diplomats, there are no outsiders, but the process is being televised. And contrasted to this is a secret diplomacy. Secret diplomacy is when it is a secretive negotiation, it is confined, there are no outsiders, there is no televisation, there is no broadcast of this kind of diplomatic procedure. Secret, if we look at the kind open diplomacy, are mainly connected with modern diplomacy, which has multilateral actors, many actors. Therefore, if you have so many actors, you cannot keep it secret, it will be open. Secret are mostly bilateral diplomatic procedures, that is between 2 countries it is very easy to keep matters secret. The second type of diplomacy is called private diplomacy or public diplomacy. Private diplomacy is a kind of diplomacy which takes place at the initiative of private individuals. For example, let us say that there is somebody who has been nominated by the government, like Nixon, he used to rely a lot on Henry Kissinger. Then Jimmy Carter has been one man army doing diplomatic activities in many of the countries. So, this is a private activity, that is one person is involved. Public diplomacy means a whole lot of it's a paraphernalia of procedure, that is there are seniority, then there is a gamut of diplomats who are taking part in the diplomatic negotiation. This is called public diplomacy. Sometimes when the heads of the states, they meet at their own initiative and secretly, or they just the 2 of them are meeting, it is also dubbed as private diplomacy. And public is when for example a group or delegation would go and meet. So, it is a public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is more structured, private diplomacy is more flexible, it is open to the art and trick and the negotiating skills of the private individuals who are negotiating. Then there is the third type of dividing diplomacy is called pure or mixed diplomacy. When we are using only political processes, diplomatic techniques and mixing it with no other issues or instruments, it is called pure diplomacy. For example, if we are only talking about taking into consideration political actors and we are only talking about political issues, it is pure diplomacy. The moment we bring in other instruments like other aspects like economy, if we are using economy as a diplomatic technique, or we are using military as a diplomatic technique, then it is called mixed diplomacy. Modern current diplomacy or modern day diplomacy, if we analyze, is more of a mixed diplomacy and never pure. The fourth way of dividing diplomacy is called traditional or new diplomacy. That is, certain diplomatic techniques are traditional, that is traditional was the one which could trace its lineage to medieval Europe, especially 1648 when the modern nation states emerged and from Treaty of Westphalia, and to the 19th century. 19th century importantly was called the century of peace in Europe. So, traditional diplomacy has a very limited and very defined roles, whereas new diplomacy is more flexible. It has changing paradigms, it has changing roles, it has lot of variations. We will be doing this when we in the next series, when we talk about these types of diplomacy, and then it would be also important and pertinent to compare what is traditional and what is new diplomacy. Now, looking at diplomacy, we say that diplomacy is a procedure. Okay. So, if it is a procedure, it must involve 3 important things. First is structure. Structure is who are the actors involved, how do we, what are the methods or what are the means through which we are negotiating. Therefore, this includes the actors involved. Actors involved would include the human resources, as I told earlier, the diplomatic staff, the people involved, and the other thing that we have to look is the physical infrastructure, that is the diplomatic mission, which is in constant link with its own foreign affairs ministry in its own home state. So, this is the structure. Then process, the method in which it is organized, how is it organized, what is the procedure. What is the procedure means what are the techniques or what are the tools that are being used, is it secretive, is it bilateral, is it using some other instruments. Then the third parameter for conducting diplomatic relations is agenda. Agenda is what are the issues that are taken up or what are the substances of this negotiation. What is keeping these diplomats together, what is making them negotiate, that is what is the agenda. So, agenda is another important thing. Agenda could be, for example, bilateral or multilateral, it could be agenda of trade, it could be about fair treatment to prisoners of war. So, these are the agendas that we take up. Now, coming to the first type of diplomacy. Now, we have done the traditional structure of diplomacy. Now, if we come to the first type of diplomacy, which is called the traditional diplomacy, we look at the structure. What is the structure of a traditional diplomacy? As we know, traditional diplomacy is a communication process between states. Traditional diplomacy importantly emerged after the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia with the emergence of modern nation states and went on till the end of 19th century. It was basically Europe centric, most of the negotiations, because the other countries were still they were still not decolonized, they were under colonial rules. So, there was no question of them having independent diplomatic relations with other countries. They were still not independent, they were not sovereign states. Therefore, this is strictly between 1648 till the end of the 19th century. Then it was a communication process between recognizably modern states rather than political organizations or institutions, like churches were no longer the actors or trade unions were no longer the actors, it was the modern nation state. Then there were institutions that emerged which had diplomacy as their main agenda, like it was not the government which was doing multitasking, they were also negotiating trade issues, they were negotiating foreign policies, they were negotiating the aspects of citizens. No, it was these the structure of the traditional diplomatic system, like the institutions, they had a very narrow focus and mandate, and that was carrying out diplomatic activities. Then now embassies were set up, resident missions or high commissions were set up. There were highly specialized institutions, some of them were professionally trained, those who were not had some kind of educational background in conducting diplomacy, and these professional diplomats, which were mostly career diplomats or they had a cadre to themselves, they became involved in the traditional diplomatic structures. Now, there were as I told you, there was these dedicated people, they were more organized, they were more systematic, they knew how to go about conducting diplomacy. Coming to the process of the traditional diplomacy, it was a bilateral affair usually undertaken in secrecy. Why secrecy? Because as I told you, the earlier diplomatic technique or process was mostly between two countries. It was based on mutual agreement for settling disputes. Both the countries wanted to come out of that sticky situation. Both of them wanted a solution, a mutual solution, and the very fact that they had decided that they need a mutual agreement or solution, that is why they had come together. Then from the 15th century, diplomacy became a more regularized process because diplomatic protocols were established. Diplomatic protocols are things like definite procedures for signing treaties, definite procedure for recruiting diplomatic staff, definite privileges, immunities and rights which are being guaranteed to the diplomatic staff. Then the most important thing about this diplomatic protocol or giving immunities or privileges to the people were twofold. First was these people, diplomats, should be able to conduct business without fear of any ill treatment. One. Second was that an ambassador, being the representative of the government of his country, must be treated with due regards and as if he were the main leader of his country. So, he had to given due respect while negotiating. Now, the concept of extraterritoriality was introduced. The concept of extraterritoriality is a very unique concept. It is a legal concept in which the resident embassy or the resident mission and the diplomatic staff abroad are part of the territory of the home state and the rules and regulations of the home state apply within that territory. This is extraterritoriality. So, they are subject to their own laws and not to the laws of the other country, and this was confined basically to Europe. Now, the agenda was mostly bilateral, that is, what were the issues that they were negotiating? These were strictly bilateral, and the issues more often than not they reflected personal ambitions of the rulers. Like for example, I would like to quote one of the diplomats, Henry Wotton. He was an Elizabethan diplomat and he would often say that who is a diplomat, and he would say that he is an honest man who is sent abroad to lie on behalf of his country. And then this diplomat who goes there to lie is using dishonesty and deceit rather than fair means. So, this was all about diplomatic techniques. The next class or the next session would deal with newer techniques of diplomacy, the new agenda of diplomacy. The new agenda does not mean something is new, but it is not this, there is no a drastic change in the structure of diplomacy, but of course the agenda change. The agenda change is most importantly due to the fact that the world had gone through two important wars, the First World War and the Second World War, and then after that we had a period of Cold War, and the post Cold War period was very important because the post Cold War the world was moving from bipolarism to unipolarism and now towards multipolarism. So, the agenda, the procedures of diplomacy are undergoing a sea change. Now, it is very important that diplomacy must be set in the political background, political background of the country. That is, diplomacy is not something independent or sovereign. It is a procedure which is guided or often biased by the political leadership of the country. So, it represents an interaction nevertheless between different actors, between different countries of the world, but no country is willing to yield as much as the other country wants. It has certain limitations and there are certain issues on which it will not bend. I think so. If we were to summarize diplomacy, it would be that it is a method or precondition for establishing permanent peace. And how do you bring about permanent peace? It is through there are certain instruments, and those instruments are the diplomatic staff or representatives and the permanent embassies, high commissions or permanent resident missions, and the objective of course is bringing about stability in the world order and of course defending the national interest of a country. With this, I think I should conclude today's series, and the next series I would be doing the other types of diplomacy, which is importantly the new diplomacy, and I would also be looking into some of the recent issues of diplomacy. Thank you.
Okay, as you told, we will discuss the recent issue later on. But one thing which I'd like to know, because this is a new phenomena to calling any diplomat and register a complaint, which was not so frequent in the past. So how this give a shift in the diplomacy between two countries?
As I
Does it kind of have impact as just a routine sort of thing it is now?
No, this is not a routine. This is something which will definitely have an impact, because see, as I told in the course of the lecture, he is also the legal representative. That means if you are asking him to explain, because this is the immunity that a diplomat enjoys.
Okay.
He has certain privileges, he has certain rights, and you cannot question his whatever verdict he is saying, because he is more of